Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus A330 pilot, and welcome to our tutorial on how to use the normal checklists in the Airbus A330. This of course applies to the A320 family as well, with a small modification that the A320 has one additional item on the shutdown checklist, which is the wing lights, which doesn't apply to the A330. Now, let's go ahead and have a look at what the normal checklists look like. I designed this document specifically for you guys, and you can grab it on flightsim.to, linked in the video description and the pinned comment below. These represent the actual A330 normal checklists as you would find them in any normal operation, and as mentioned, these also apply to the A320 with one exception, that's the parking checklist, which also includes the wing lights. Now let's have a look at some of the general theory, and then I'm going to show you those checklists in action. Airbus normal checklists are of a non-action type. That means all actions should be completed from memory before the flight crew performs the checklist. Normally the pilot flying requests the checklist and the pilot monitoring actions it. The checklist actions are referred to as challenge and response type actions. The pilot monitoring reads the left part of a line, and the pilot flying responds to the challenge only after checking the current status of the aircraft. If the current status of the aircraft does not correspond to the checklist response, the pilot flying takes corrective action before responding to the challenge. If corrective action is not possible, then the pilot flying modifies the response to reflect the real situation with a specific answer. When necessary, the other flight crew member cross-checks the validity of the performance, which is indicated by the both line in the checklist. For example, this applies to the barometric reference, which has to be set on both sides of the aircraft. When a checklist is complete, the pilot monitoring announces, for example, landing checklist complete. The only checklist that does deviate from these norms is the securing the aircraft checklist, which is done in a captain and first officer way, rather than the pilot flying and pilot monitoring way that is applied to the rest of the checklists. So, with all these theories now out of hand, let's go ahead and have a look at the first checklist, which is the cockpit preparation checklist. The trigger to run this checklist is once the departure briefing is completed. Now let's go ahead and have a look at how exactly this checklist is done. The first item on the checklist is gear pins and covers, and these are normally checked during the walk-around, and then we also check that the pins and covers are actually on board the aircraft, and you can find them located right down here. Through this little hole over here we can see that the pins are actually inside. Now the answer to this one is simply removed. The next check is the fuel quantity, and on this one the pilot flying checks the fuel on board and fuel distribution on the fuel system display page and compares with a computerized flight plan. So when the challenge is done, you are going to open the fuel page. You check over here that the fuel is evenly distributed and that the total fuel on board equals at least the required fuel on board from the flight plan. The correct answer then is, for example, 10,020 kilograms balanced. Note that for balanced you cross-check all the different parts of the tanks and really make sure that the fuel is balanced within the limits from the flight crew operations manual. The next item is seatbelts, and for this you simply check the seatbelt memo on the ECAM and the correct response is on. Next up we have the ADIRS. And for this you go into the MCDU onto the data page, position monitor, and down here you cross-check that all three IRSs are in the nav position. Last but not least, we've got the baro reference challenge, and for this the pilot flying and pilot monitoring check and read the QNH baro setting or the QFE baro setting if fitted to the aircraft. So, for example, you go down here on the primary flight display, QNH 1015, then you check the same on all the other three displays. The pilot monitoring also reads out the same, QNH 1015, and with that the cockpit preparation checklist is completed, and we can now fast forward to the next checklist. Our next checklist is going to be the before start checklist. The trigger to execute this checklist is the pushback clearance or start clearance have been received, and the before start flow pattern has been completed. Park and brake. And for this one, you check the park and brake memo on the eCam, and you also check that the brake pressure is indeed applied or not, depending on the actual state of the brake. The correct answer is either set or released. Next, we've got takeoff speeds and thrust, and for this, the pilot flying first reads the three values, V1, VR, V2, and the flex temperature from the FMS performance page, while the pilot monitoring checks that the V1 and the V2 are indeed shown on the primary flight display. So the correct answer here is V1 137, VR 150, V2 152, flexed 72, and then the pilot monitoring would read out the same, and while the pilot monitoring reads them out, you check on the primary flight display that those values are indeed indicated. Next, we check the windows, and for this we check that the handle is all the way forward and that the red marker over here is not showing. So just to show you, this is what it would look like if the red marker was visible. So let's go ahead and close that window once again. And you can see that when the window correctly locks, the red marker is no longer visible. This is checked on both sides, so both pilots are going to respond closed. Last, on the before start checklist, we check the beacon, and for this we check the position of the switch and then call out on. And that's the before start checklist complete. Once the engine start is completed and the after start items actioned and the cleared signal from the ramp agent is received, we can go ahead and run the after start checklist. For the after start checklist, our first item is the anti-ice, and for this we check the anti-ice push buttons on the overhead panel as well as the indications on our eCam. The answer then is either off, engines on, or engines on, wing on. Next up we check the eCam status, and for this we check that the eCam status reminder over here on the eCam is not displayed. Now just to show you what it would look like, if I turned one of the packs off, then we should get the STS showing over here, like we can see right now. If the STS shows, then you need to open the status page and check exactly what it is that you see over there. The next item is the pitch trim, and the pilot flying checks the pitch trim wheel is at the takeoff CG value in the load sheet. Now, what you can do over here, in order to make your life easier, is you have a look down at the growth weight CG down here on the eCam, which is 24.5 at the moment, and then you check that indeed you see 24.5 next to the white triangle up here on our trim scale. The last item on the after start checklist is the rudder trim, and for this we check that the rudder trim is showing neutral down here on the trim indicator. Now the tolerance for this is plus minus 0.6 degrees, so if you just see slight deviation, something like this, that's the maximum that is acceptable over here. The answer to the challenge is neutral, and that's the after start checklist complete. We're now taxiing out to our departure runway, and once the takeoff config push button has been pressed as part of the taxi procedure, we can run the taxi checklist. Note that we should wait until the cabin is also ready, so until the eCam memo is actually completely green before we call for the checklist. The first point is flight controls. And the pilot flying confirms that the flight control check was performed and replies checked, and the pilot monitoring also confirms this and also replies checked. The next point is flaps setting, and we check and compare the flap setting on the engine warning display as well as on our takeoff performance page, and we ensure that we have the same flap setting set. The answer is then according to the flap setting, so for example config 1 plus F, config 2, or whatever applies. The next challenge is radar and predictive wind shear, and for this challenge the pilot flying checks on the nav display that the weather radar is on, as you can see in the bottom right corner of the nav display down here. Then we check on the pedestal that the predictive wind shear switch is in the auto position, as we can see down here. You can also nicely verify this, because if the predictive wind shear switch would not be in auto, you would get an amber predictive wind shear indication on the engine warning display. The correct answer is on and auto. The next challenge is engine start selector, and for this we check the position of the engine start selector, which you can either do down here on the pedestal, or you look up at your systems and you read what your displays say. In other words, if the switch was in the ignition start position, then you would see an ignition memo up here on your eCam. If on the other hand side the switch would be in the crank position, then, normally, the engine display should show on the eCam display. Now, that means if the switch is in the norm position, you will not see the engine display and you will not see the ignition memo. The correct answer is either ignition or norm. Last, we checked the eCam memo, and for this we check that all of the indications are green, and the answer is takeoff, no blue. And that's the taxi checklist completed. We have received our lineup clearance, and the lineup flow pattern has been completed, and these are our triggers to start the lineup checklist. The first item is takeoff runway, and on this the pilot flying and pilot monitoring confirm that the lineup is performed on the intended runway and intersection. The correct answer is, for example, runway 34 right, alpha. So we verify 34 right, and we verify we're at intersection alpha. The next item is going to be the TCAS, and for this the pilot flying checks the TCAS mode selector. Now you can do that down here and verify that it is indeed in the TARA position, or you can look at your nav display, and on here you can see that the lines on the 2.5 mile ring have changed into a different layout, and this also indicates to you that the TCAS is indeed operating. Now the correct answer is either TA only or TARA, depending on what is selected down here on the TCAS mode selector. The last item of the lineup checklist is PACs 1 and 2, and for this the pilot flying checks the PAC 1 push button switch, PAC 2 push button switch and APU push button switch on the air overhead panel, and then replies with either on supplied by APU, or off. So you've got three options over here. Either the PACs are on, that would be this state, or the PACs may be supplied by the APU, that's the case if both PACs are on and the APU bleed is selected, or the PACs are off, which is the normal position that we use for most takeoffs. And that's your lineup checklist completed. We just got ourselves into a rather unfortunate situation. We've received a re-clearance of either our takeoff runway or our SID by air traffic control after the original takeoff briefing was already completed at the gate. Whenever this happens, and after you have done the complete setup, and once the revised departure briefing is completed, we are going to run the departure change checklist. Now the departure change checklist contains the following items: runway and SID, and for this the pilot flying checks the runway, the shift and the takeoff SID on the FMS. So you check the runway, you check the takeoff shift, and you check the SID that has been entered. And the correct reply is, for example, runway 34 right, shift 0 meters, SID also to echo. The next point is the flap setting, and for this, just like on our taxi checklist, we both pilot flying and pilot monitoring check and compare the flap setting on the engine warning display as well as on the FMS performance page. The correct answer then again is, for example, config 1 plus F, config 2, config 3. The next item is takeoff speeds and thrust, and just like during the takeoff checklists, just like during the taxi checklist, the pilot flying is going to read out V1 137, VR 150, V2 152, flex 72, And then the pilot monitoring is going to do the same, and you cross-check the data on the primary flight display. Last, we have FCU Alt, and for this the pilot flying checks the altitude on the glare shield, so for example 4,000 feet. And that's the departure change checklist complete. There is no after takeoff checklist, so the next one is going to be the approach checklist straight away. We are now in the air, and the next item on the list is, technically speaking, not a checklist, however it is just as important, and that's the acceleration flow pattern. So we need to carry this out once we are in the air and once the after takeoff items have been completed. Now, the acceleration flow pattern ensures that the aircraft is correctly accelerating towards climb speed, and here is what to do and how to do it. So we start on the pedestal by looking at the flaps and ensuring that the flaps are up. Then we move over to our spoilers and ensure that the ground spoilers are disarmed. Next we check that the landing gear is up, and last but not least we move to the exterior lights and verify that they are set. Exterior lights set means strobe lights on, beacon light on, nav and logo light as needed, the wing light as needed, landing light on, nose lights off, runway turn-off lights off. So on, as needed, off, on, off. And that's the acceleration flow pattern completed. We are now below 10,000 feet, and the altimeter has been set to the local barometric reference. Those two are the triggers for the approach checklist. Baro reference, and again the pilot flying and pilot monitoring check and read the QNH baro setting from the primary flight display. So in our case the correct answer is QNH 1012. Seatbelts. The pilot flying checks the memo on the ECAM and announces on. Minimum. For this one the pilot flying checks the baro or radio minimum on the FMA. In our case the pilot flying will announce baro 300 feet. Alternatively, if a radio minimum is used, the answer is radio, for example 160 feet, or no decision height if a Cat 3 approach is flown with no decision height. Next up we check the auto brake, and for this one the pilot flying checks the auto brake mode on the auto brake panel and then announces, for example, low, medium, or in our case today, off. Last we have the engine start selector, and for this the pilot flying checks the position of the engine start selector, again either down here on the pedestal or by checking that there is no engine page and no ignition displayed on the ECAM, and then you can also deduct that the selector is in the norm position. And that's the approach checklist completed. We're established on the final approach in the landing configuration, and the cabin report has been received. With this, we are now going to read the landing checklist. And that is fairly easy. ECAM memo, and the answer to that is landing no blue. The pilot flying checks that no blue items are listed on the ECAM memo, and that is your entire landing checklist already complete. As easy as it gets, isn't it? And welcome to our destination. We've just made a beautiful smooth landing right on the aiming point, and we have completed the after landing flow pattern. Now, you don't need to use the beautiful landing exactly on the aiming point as a criteria for the after landing checklist. However, the after landing flow pattern completed is most certainly the checklist trigger for the after landing checklist. The checklist itself is fairly easy: radar and predictive wind shear, and the pilot flying checks on the pedestal that the weather radar and predictive wind shear switches are off. Now you will find those located right down here. So you've got weather radar system off, predictive wind shear off, and that's the after landing checklist completed. Note that you can verify those on your flight instruments by first of all seeing that there is no indications of the weather radar down here, and seeing that you have the predictive wind shear off annunciation in your ECAM. And that's the after landing checklist complete. The trigger for the parking checklist is the completion of the parking flow pattern. Park and brake or chocks, and we verify that the green park brake memo displays, or confirm that the ground personnel has set the chocks, and then reply either park and brake set or chocks set. Engines, For this we check the engine master levers, and we also check the engine parameters on the engine warning display and announce off. Last but not least, we've got the fuel pumps, and for this we check that all the fuel pumps are off on the overhead panel and announce off. Now, if you are flying an A320 family aircraft, you will also check the wing light to be off and announce off there as well. However, that's not part of the A330 checklist, as you can see on screen. And that's the parking checklist completed. We arrived on block and our passengers have deboarded. With that, we have secured our aircraft, and after the last passenger has left the aircraft, the securing the aircraft checklist can be read. So that's going to be oxygen off, and the CM2, that's the co-pilot, checks that the crew supply push button switch on the oxygen panel on the overhead is in the off position. Emergency exit lights off. CM2 checks that the emergency exit light switch is in the off position. And last but not least, batteries off. CM2 checks the battery push button switch on the electric overhead panels are all three off. And that concludes a successful flight. I hope that you have enjoyed this tutorial. Be sure to leave your feedback in the comments below. And again, if you are looking for a download for the checklists used in this video, you can find it linked in the video description and in the pinned comment below. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I hope you have learned something today. As always, be sure to leave your feedback in the comments below. Like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you for watching, and I see you all again on the next one.